Welcome everyone to German Tool Reviews. Today we have the Compact Cable Cutter Showdown. For the purposes of this review, I'm arbitrarily finding a compact cable cutter as one that is less than 7 inches or 175 millimeters in length. A cable cutter differs from a side cutter in that it uses a shearing action rather than a pinching action to cut the material. This is useful for cutting cables with a semiconductor material or multiple conductors that can be damaged by a regular side cutter. First, let's take a look at the German brand candidates. We have the Knipex 9511165, made in Germany. This particular model has the plastic-coated handles. Knipex offers several variations of this model that include the 2-component handles, chrome-plated, insulated, and ones with a spring return. Next up we have the Ghidorah 8090-170TL, made in Germany. I suspect that this is a rebranded product from Knipex or one of its subsidiaries. One thing to note is that the Ghidorah only offers this size with the spring return feature. I'll take this into account later in the review when doing some of the testing of the cutters. I do want to note that this Ghidorah model is significantly less in cost than the equivalent version of the Knipex pliers with the spring return, which would be part number 9521165. Then we have the Filo 54-01640, made in Germany. The Filo unit is actually a rebranded version of the NWS 04349 VDE 160 model. It looks like at this time Filo only offers the insulated version of this tool. The list price for both the Filo and NWS units is exactly the same for this particular unit, so there's no real savings in buying the NWS version over this one. Next up we have the Wiha 32600, made in Vietnam. Similarly to the Filo, this Wiha unit has a serrated blade, but only on one half, with the other being a standard edge. To add some controls to the comparison, I brought in some other brands to compare these against. First one is the Southwire CCP6D, made in China. When I originally ordered these from Amazon, I was mistakenly under the impression that Southwire tools were made in the USA. This is why I didn't think much of the price, with it being almost as much as the Knipex and more than the Wiha unit. I was surprised to see that this was made in China. I paid just over $25 for these from Amazon. Then we have the Baco 2233D-160, made in China. I was also surprised when I got this to find it was made in China, considering Snap-on's website, who currently owns the Baco brand, has the COA listed as Spain. They may want to update that. This particular unit was exceptionally cheap, picking up from Amazon for about $12 ship. Then we have the Tsunoda CA22, made in Japan, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. This is a brand that I've never used before, but they're supposed to be very high quality and are known for the quality of their steel. I was surprised how cheap they were. I was able to get these for about $15 from Amazon. I was really looking to get the Klein unit for this test, but the cable cutters they marketed as compact are actually over 8 inches in length, and therefore would not be inclusive in this comparison. So now let's talk a little bit about how I'm going to score each of these units. I decided to keep the subjective categories to a minimum, and I'm only going to score it on 3 main sections. First, with price at 5%, with the lower price being better. Next, the overall design, workmanship, and impressions of the unit at 15%. Finally, the cutting performance at 80%, which is what we really want to know and the entire reason we are using the tool. You should really take these breakdowns with a grain of salt, as anyone could manipulate the percentages and add categories to bias the results toward a certain winner. These percentages were really just chosen as my personal criteria for evaluating this class of tools. Now getting into price scoring. Normally when scoring price I take the MSRP of each unit, but I had difficulty finding the list price for a couple of the non-German brands, and the prices from the distributors were all over the place. So what I did is actually use the price that I actually paid for each item, and then normalized it to give it a score between 1 and 10, with 10 being the lowest price unit. The cheapest unit was actually the Baco, followed close by the Tsunoda and Wiha. I ended up paying about the same amount for the Knipex, Ghidorah, and Filo units, which was around 3 times the cost of the Baco. The Southwire was about double the cost of the Baco unit. Now going into the design, workmanship, and quality scoring. First thing I'm going to do before taking any inspections of the units is to clean them all with Ballistol that will remove any residual shipping grease or protective oils that were added by the factory. This will also allow the joints to be oiled in a fair manner for the upcoming cutting test. Looking first at the Knipex and Ghidorah units together. The reason I'm grouping these together is because after close examination, I am convinced that they have come from the same manufacturer, with my guess being Knipex or its subsidiary Randstad. The only real difference I see in the forging dies is the ridge near the edge of the pliers is more pronounced on the Ghidorah units. Even the adjustment screws and joint design are exactly the same in both units. I tried my best to find any defects or things I didn't like about these. I even put the edges and ground surface under magnification to see if there are any defects, but everything looked alright. You can definitely tell these were ground down by the same surface grinder from a distinct pattern and width of each pass, which will always be slightly different between manufacturers. Therefore, I gave both the Ghidorah and Knipex units a 10 in this category. The Philo unit is interesting because it has serrated cutting edges which extend far into the forging die. I think someone at NWS was a fishing fan because the particular pattern certainly reminds me of the lower fins of a brackish type fish. One major issue I see in this unit is that there is an overbite that allows for some very sharp edges to protrude from the end. This could be a bit of a problem if you stick it somewhere where you can damage a tool pocket or damage other adjacent tools. I'm not really a big fan of the nut used to tension the unit, with only a very small portion of it protruding. I would be concerned about stripping it when doing adjustments, since only about a third of it is accessible. For these two minor issues, I give the Philo an 8. The VHA unit is definitely a unique design, with one jaw being serrated and the other being normal. This style of cable cutter has a smaller portion at the end that is intended to be used as a makeshift wire stripper. Looking closely at the ground surfaces, there appears to be some sort of strange material or lacquer applied that did not come off with the ballast tool. I'm guessing it's some sort of clear coat polyurethane. The only issue I saw on the VHA units is that there was a very sharp edge on the inner part of the head that should have been deburred like the rest of the edges are. Not likely you would put your hand here often, but it could definitely be an issue. For this one issue, I give the VHA a 9. The Sunuda has a similar design to both the VHA and Bako units. One thing I'm not particularly fond of this design is that there was no stop when opening it. This, I believe, is to provide a secondary drag cutting function that I know I will probably never use. The ground surfaces and edges look quite good on this model. Just because of personal preference against the design, I gave this unit a 9, but I saw no other issues. Even though the Sunuda and Bako look very similar, you can really tell which one was manufactured to higher standards when you really look close at a couple of things. The first thing I noticed is that the lapping on the rivet joint was done so poorly that when you open it up, there are ridges formed around the rivet. This indicates that the surface is not flat and has a bit of a bow to it, most likely due to poor manufacturing practices. The second most prevalent issue is the terrible job that was done grounding the cutting surface. It's almost like they weren't sure which direction to grind the surface in, so they did it in every direction. The edges on the blade also look really bad here. For these issues, I gave the Bako a 7. First thing you'll notice about the Southwire unit is how stiff the joints are even after oiling it. I may have been able to loosen this using the screw, but this is not something I needed to do with the other units, so I kept it factory configured. I felt like the screw protruding at the back should have been ground down much more than it was, as it created quite a sharp surface around the ring of it. The ground surfaces were also not very impressive, but the edge did seem adequate. For the aforementioned reasons, I gave this unit a 6. Now for the cutting performance test. In order to test the cutting performance of each unit, I wanted to see how much force it would take to get through a couple of cable samples. To do this fairly, I measured 100 millimeters from the fulcrum point and marked it with a piece of tape and marker. To see how much force it takes to get through the wire, I'm using one of these push-pull gauges that measures the force applied in newtons. Setting it to the peak function, I can see how much force it took to get through each cable sample. Before I did that, there was one measurement I needed to make in order to correct the readings for the spring installed in the Ghidorah unit. Taking 3 readings, I got a spring tension of around 10.8 newtons, or about 2.5 pounds of force. I subtracted this value from all the Ghidorah readings in order to correct for the additional force needed to overcome the spring tension. I picked a total of 4 different cable and wire samples to try with each unit. That should be a pretty good representation of the types of wires that each can handle. First cable is a 3-conductor shielded cable with Teflon jacket. For each unit, I took a total of 3 readings and then averaged them to get a final value. Then I weighted these values to give the best performing unit a 10 and each other unit a score proportional to how it did against that best unit. I did change out the tip on the force gauge after a couple of samples to one that was more flat because it was leaving some marks on some of the handles. For the first cable sample, the readings were relatively consistent at about 38 to 41 newtons for all units except for the Philo and Southwire. The readings I was getting for the Philo were quite surprising as it performed about 20% better than any other unit. The Southwire, on the other hand, performed about 20% worse than all the units. The second cable sample was some stranded 4 American wire gauge copper with a Teflon jacket. This is really on the upper end of the capacities on some of these units. The results here were interesting as the Philo, VHA, and Sunuda scored almost exactly the same. The Bako was a little bit behind those, followed by the Knipex, Ghidorah, and Southwire units. The third cable sample is this FlexGuard control cable that contains 3 12 American wire gauge conductors and a thick PVC jacket. With the large outer jacket diameter, we saw some differences again in the results. The best unit again was the Philo, with the Knipex and Ghidorah close behind. The Sunuda and Bako were next, and the worst performing units were the Viha and Southwire. The final sample is some twin axial cable with a PVC jacket that is 8.3 millimeters in diameter. Again, the Philo was far and away the better performer here, with the Knipex, Ghidorah, and Viha units together a marginally close second. The Sunuda and Bako were next, and then bringing up the rear was the Southwire again. If you take the normalized score from each of the 4 samples and weigh them each with 25%, you get an overall score that determines which unit cuts cables with the least amount of force. Philo unit really did blow the others out of the water here with these particular cable samples. I'm sure I could find some cable that will perform better on other units. From these tests done here, I've concluded that the Philo is actually cutting the best overall. Philo came out with a weighted score of 9.97. Second through 5th place was really close, with only about half a point separating them. In second place was the Ghidorah unit with 8.54. Third was the Knipex with 8.52. Fourth was the Viha at 8.44. Fifth is the Sunuda at 8.29. And last was the Southwire at 7.01. What I learned through these 4 samples is that some designs appear to cut better than others. It was surprising to me that the cables with the serrated blade edges seemed to be doing a much better job cutting than those that had a curved edge. It got me to wondering why all brands aren't using a serrated edge for this type of tool. Looking at the edges of the cable jacket after using a Philo unit, you can see there are definite teeth marks around the perimeter. There must be some application where this would be undesirable, otherwise all companies would probably use this serrated edge design. Examining the same cable cutting with the Knipex, you can see a much smoother jacket perimeter. If we total the scores using the previously mentioned criteria, we can now rank the candidates up to 2 significant digits. There was a clear winner, and that was the Philo due to it destroying the competition on the cutting test. The unit did have one of the highest costs, and there were a couple of design issues that I mentioned, but it's hard not to recommend the Philo unit from the way it performed on a variety of cable samples. In second place, with what I consider quite an upset, was the Viha unit. While it wasn't as good in cutting performance as some other units, it made up ground for being one of the cheapest units and therefore ends up being a great value. I had just a few small things to nitpick about the finishing, but it really surprised me how well it did. In third place was a literal tie between the Ghidorah and Knipex units. While the Ghidorah scored slightly better in cutting performance than the Knipex, it was a little bit more expensive, which made them end up in a dead heat. It would make sense for them to score similarly if they really are from the same manufacturer. In terms of a buying guide, if you really wanted a unit with a return spring, then I would definitely go with the Ghidorah unit over the equivalent Knipex because it would end up being quite a bit cheaper. If you absolutely need a unit without the return spring, then you have to go with the Knipex because Ghidorah does not currently offer a model without the return spring at this time. In fifth place, just barely behind the Ghidorah and Knipex unit, was the Sunuda. It had some difficulty with some of the larger cable diameters that dragged its cutting performance score down, otherwise it may have come in third. I didn't mention this before, but this is the lightest and most compact of all the candidates, so it might be something to consider when picking a unit out. In sixth place was the Bako. I think it could have done much better if they spent a little bit more time grounding the edges and getting that blade edge sharp from the factory. I'm sure the sloppy lap joint didn't help things either. In last place was the Southwire unit, which frankly was quite an embarrassment compared to the other units. It performed much more like a $5 tool than a $25 tool in my opinion. But hopefully you guys enjoyed that showdown of some compact cable cutters. Possibly in the future I will do another one of these but with full-size cable cutters, so we can include some of the other brands that didn't offer compact models such as Stavilla, Hazet, Klein, and Channellock. Check out the link in the description to the 4 of you. There are also some affiliate links in the description if you feel the urge to pick any of these units up. Have a good week, and I'll catch you guys next time.